On a sweltering afternoon in early 1942, over the turquoise waters of the Coral Sea, an American pilot named John wrestled with the controls of his F4F Wildcat. The air in the cockpit was thick and humid, smelling of oil and sweat. Below him, the vast, shimmering expanse of the Pacific was a beautiful, indifferent canvas. But he wasn't looking down. His eyes, and the eyes of every pilot in his squadron, were scanning the empty blue above and around them. They were hunting, but they were also the hunted. For the American pilots in the early days of the Pacific War, the sky had a ghost, a fast, ethereal, and deadly phantom that appeared as a silver glint in the sun, danced through their formations with impossible grace, and vanished as quickly as it came, often leaving a trail of fire and wreckage in its wake. This ghost had a name, the Mitsubishi A6M, known to the Allies simply as the Zero. To understand the story of the Hellcat, you must first understand the legend of the Zero. It wasn't just an airplane. It was a symbol of Japan's startling military prowess. It was the samurai's blade turned into a flying machine. When it first appeared, Allied pilots had never seen anything like it. It could climb at a rate that seemed to defy gravity, clawing its way into the sky faster than any fighter they had. It could turn on a whisper, executing maneuvers so tight that an American plane attempting to follow would shudder, stall, and fall away. In the hands of a veteran Japanese naval aviator, a pilot who had spent years honing his craft to perfection, the Zero was less a machine and more an extension of the pilot's will. Imagine yourself as one of those early Wildcat pilots. The F4F Wildcat was a good plane. It was tough, rugged, and could take an incredible amount of punishment. Pilots called their Grumman-built planes Grumman Iron Works for a reason. They were dependable. But against a Zero, dependability wasn't enough. You would be in a dogfight, trying to get a shot on an enemy bomber when your wingman's voice would crackle over the radio, tense and sharp. "Zero on your 6. You would throw your stick to the side, kicking like fiction. They spoke of a fighter that could outclimb and outturn anything they had. They spoke of a myth. This was the challenge that faced the United States Navy. They were losing planes, but more importantly, they were losing skilled, experienced pilots. A plane could be replaced in a matter of weeks. A veteran pilot took years to train. Back in Bethpage, New York, far from the Pacific sun, a man named Leroy Grumman was listening to these stories with intense focus. Grumman, the founder of the company that built the Wildcat, had a reputation for building tough airplanes. But he also had a deeply personal connection to the men who flew them. He saw them as his pilots, and he was determined to give them a tool that would not just allow them to survive, but allow them to dominate. The US Navy knew they couldn't just build a better Zero. The Japanese design philosophy was fundamentally different. They had prioritized performance above all else. To make the Zero so incredibly agile, they had stripped it of almost everything that made a plane heavy. There was no armor plating to protect the pilot. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb a bullet hit without erupting into flames. The Zero was a masterpiece of aerodynamics, but it was fragile. It was a glass cannon. Leroy Grumman and his chief engineer, Jake Swerble, took a different approach. Their philosophy was simple. The pilot was the most important part of the airplane. The machine was expendable. The man inside was not. They had already been working on a successor to the Wildcat, a prototype called the XF-6F. But the reports coming back from the Pacific changed everything. They didn't just need a better plane. They needed a purpose-built Zero killer. So they gathered every piece of combat data they could. They interviewed pilots who had managed to fight a Zero and live. One of those pilots was Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch. He had seen firsthand how the Zero could outmaneuver the Wildcat. But instead of despairing, he and his squadron developed a tactic, a defensive maneuver that would become legendary. The Thatch Weave. 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine that could churn out an immense 2,000 horsepower. It was a monster. It was heavy, but it produced raw, brute force. This engine would give the new fighter the one thing the Zero couldn't compete with: speed in a dive and a phenomenal rate of climb. The plan was simple. If you can't outdance your opponent, hit him with so much force that he can't get back up. Next came survivability. Grumman's team loaded the new design with everything the Zero lacked. They added over 200 pounds of armor plating around the cockpit to protect the pilot. They installed a bulletproof windshield. They lined the fuel tanks with self-sealing rubber so that if a bullet pierced the tank, the fuel would cause the rubber to swell and plug the hole, preventing a catastrophic fire. And finally, they gave it claws. 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing. These weren't the cannons of the Zero, but they fired a hail of heavy slugs at such a high rate that pilots would later describe it as a buzzsaw. The guns were reliable, accurate, and carried a tremendous amount of ammunition. Over 2,400 rounds in total. A pilot could hold down the trigger for nearly 30 seconds, pouring a stream of lead into an enemy aircraft. The result of this philosophy was a plane that looked like the Wildcat's bigger, meaner brother. It was broad-shouldered, thick, and sat squat on its wide landing gear. It wasn't elegant or graceful like the Zero. It was a bruiser, a heavyweight boxer built to take a punch and deliver a knockout blow in return. They called it the F6F Hellcat. As the first prototypes were being tested in the summer of 1942, an incredible stroke of luck occurred. A Japanese Zero, flown by a young pilot named Tadayoshi Koga, took part in a raid on Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. His plane was hit by ground fire, damaging an oil line. Following procedure, he attempted to make an emergency landing on a nearby island, Akutan. But what he and his commanders thought was solid ground was actually a marsh. The Zero's landing gear dug into the soft tundra. The plane flipped over onto its back, and the impact instantly killed the pilot. For weeks, the Zero lay there, upside down and almost perfectly preserved in the cold, wet climate. It was finally discovered by a U.S. Navy patrol plane. This was a treasure beyond measure. For the first time, the Allies had a nearly intact Zero to study. It was carefully salvaged, shipped to San Diego, and painstakingly repaired. Now, American test pilots could fly it. They could learn its secrets, its strengths, and most importantly, its weaknesses. They confirmed what pilots in the field had reported. At high speeds, the Zero's controls became stiff and heavy. It couldn't roll very fast, especially to the right, and it couldn't dive well at all. Push the Zero into a steep, high-speed dive, and its light frame would begin to shudder violently. All of this intelligence was fed directly back to the engineers at Grumman and, crucially, to the pilots in training. By the early months of 1943, the Grumman factory in Bethpage was a hive of activity. Thousands of men and women worked around the clock, turning out Hellcats at an astonishing rate. The sound of riveting guns echoed day and night. The smell of metal and paint filled the air. They weren't just building machines. They were building hope. They were forging the tool that would finally allow their pilots to fight back. And out on the vast Pacific, on the sun-baked decks of carriers like the USS Essex, the USS Yorktown, and the USS Independence, the first F6F Hellcats began to arrive. Young naval aviators, many fresh from flight school, looked at this new machine with a mixture of awe and anticipation. It was bigger than any fighter they had ever flown. Climbing into the cockpit, they felt the protection of the armor plate behind them. When they pushed the throttle forward, they felt the raw, unrestrained power of the double Wasp engine pulling them down the deck. The Japanese pilots, still confident in their Zeros and their superior skills, continued to rule the skies. They had heard rumors of a new American fighter, but they had seen new American fighters before. None had been a match for their Zeros. They had no idea that this time was different. They had no idea that the balance of power in the Pacific was about to shift, dramatically and permanently. A new predator had entered the ecosystem of the sky, and the masters of that domain had no idea their reign was about to end. On the 31st of August, 1943, Lieutenant Junior Grade Hamilton McWhorter III sat in the cockpit of his brand new F6F Hellcat on the flight deck of the USS Yorktown. The carrier was part of a task force steaming towards Marcus Island, a small but heavily defended Japanese outpost deep in the Pacific. For McWhorter, and for many of the young pilots around him, this was it. This was their first combat mission. The air was thick with the smell of salt and aviation fuel, and the low, powerful thrum of the carrier's engines was a constant vibration felt deep in his bones. Flying the Hellcat was a different experience from the trainers he was used to. It was a substantial machine. You didn't feel like you were wearing it, as Zero pilots described their own planes. You felt like you were commanding something powerful and solid. In training, they had been drilled relentlessly on the new rules of engagement. The instructors, many of them veterans from the dark days of 1942, had been blunt. "You will not try to turn with a Zero," they'd say, their voices hard with experience. "You are not a fencer, you are a hammer. You will use your power. You will dictate the terms of the fight." The strategy was called boom and zoom, or energy fighting. A Hellcat pilot was taught to keep his speed up. He would climb high above his opponent, using the double Wasp engine to gain an altitude advantage. Then he would dive down on his target, building up tremendous speed. He would make one fast, devastating firing pass, and then use that same speed to climb back up into the safety of the vertical, far away from the Zero's nimble, turning grasp. It was a doctrine born from the Hellcat's strengths, its power, its speed in a dive, and its ruggedness. As the call came to man their planes, McWhorter went through his pre-flight checks with practiced precision, his hands moving over the switches and dials of the cockpit. He felt the familiar knot of anxiety and excitement in his stomach. Then, the signal was given. With a roar that shook the entire flight deck, his R-2800 engine caught, the huge propeller blades in front of him dissolving into a shimmering disk. One by one, the Hellcats were catapulted from the deck, a violent, controlled explosion of energy that threw the heavy fighters into the sky. They formed up in a wide, loose formation, climbing steadily into the vast morning sky. Below them, the fleet was a collection of gray shapes on an endless blue sheet. For a long while, there was nothing but the steady drone of their engines and the crackle of routine communication over the radio. They were the bait, flying ahead of the main bomber force, their job to sweep the sky of any Japanese fighters that might rise to meet them. Then, a voice cut through the calm. "Bogies, 10 o'clock high." Every head in the formation snapped in that direction. At first, they were just tiny black specks, almost indistinguishable from dust on the canopy. But they grew larger, resolving into the familiar, elegant shapes of Mitsubishi Zeros. The Japanese pilots were descending on them with confidence, coming out of the sun in a classic fighter tactic. McWhorter's heart hammered against his ribs. The ghosts were real, and they were coming for him. The training took over. His squadron commander's voice came over the radio, calm and steady. "All right, boys, remember what we practiced. Keep your speed up. Let's see what these new Grummans can do." The two formations merged in a flurry of motion. McWhorter picked out a Zero that was peeling off to engage his wingman. The Japanese pilot moved with a fluid grace that was almost hypnotic. He began a climbing turn, trying to get into a position of advantage. McWhorter's old instincts, from his training in older planes, screamed at him to turn with the Zero, to get into a classic dogfight. But the voice of his instructor echoed in his mind. "You are a hammer." Instead of turning, McWhorter nosed his Hellcat down slightly, pushing the throttle to the firewall. The plane surged forward, the engine's roar deepening. He wasn't chasing the Zero's turn, he was cutting it off, using his superior speed to close the distance on a different vector. The Zero pilot, likely surprised by the American plane's sheer acceleration, was forced to straighten out for a moment. It was the only opening McWhorter needed. He lined up the enemy aircraft in his gun sight, his thumb resting on the red button on his control stick. For a split second, the world seemed to slow down. He saw the red Hinomaru, the meatball on the Zero's fuselage. He saw the pilot's head in the canopy turning to look back. He pressed the button. The Hellcat shuddered violently as all 650 caliber machine guns erupted at once. The sound was not a pop, 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 but a deafening, visceral roar, like tearing a giant sheet of metal. A stream of bright tracer rounds reached out across the sky and slammed into the Japanese fighter. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. The Zero didn't just smoke or trail fire. Its thin aluminum skin seemed to shred. Large pieces of the wing and tail simply tore away. There was a bright flash, and the elegant fighter that had been a deadly threat just a second before was transformed into a tumbling ball of black smoke and orange flame. It fell from the sky, a broken thing, leaving a dark smear against the clean blue canvas. McWhorter pulled back on the stick, his Hellcat effortlessly converting its speed back into altitude, climbing high above the fight. He was breathing heavily, his knuckles white on the controls. It had happened so fast. There had been no graceful duel, no prolonged dance of death. It had been a brutal, efficient act of destruction. It was exactly what the plane was designed to do. All around him, the sky was filled with similar scenes. The Hellcats were refusing to be drawn into turning fights, instead making high-speed passes, their heavy machine guns tearing the fragile Zeros apart. Now, let us leave McWhorter for a moment and cross the invisible lines of the battle. Imagine you are Japanese Petty Officer First Class Kenji Tanaka, a veteran of the fighting in China and the early conquests of the Pacific. You have over 10 victories to your name. You have seen your Zero dance around lumbering American P-40s and rugged but slow Wildcats. You hold a quiet contempt for American planes and the pilots who fly them. They lack finesse. They lack the warrior's spirit, the true connection with their machine. As you dive towards the formation of new American fighters, you notice they are different. They are big, almost clumsy-looking. They resemble the Wildcats, but are somehow more menacing, thicker in the fuselage and with a wider wingspan. You smile. A bigger target. You select one that is flying straight and level, a rookie mistake, and you roll your Zero onto its tail, your movements precise and economical. This will be an easy kill. But as you close in, something strange happens. The American plane doesn't try to turn. It doesn't panic. It simply pushes its nose down and pulls away. The acceleration is startling. You push your own throttle forward, but you can't seem to close the gap. The sheer power of the American plane's engine is something you've never encountered before. It is not playing by the rules. Frustrated, you watch as it pulls away, then begins a smooth, powerful climb, using its speed to regain height. You are a master of the turning fight, but this opponent refuses to turn. While you are momentarily distracted by this baffling behavior, you glance to your side just in time to see your wingman, a young pilot named Sato, explode. There is no warning. One moment, his Zero is there, maneuvering behind another American plane. The next, it is utterly obliterated by a torrent of heavy bullets from a different attacker that dove from above. You have never seen an aircraft disintegrate so completely, so quickly. A cold feeling, something you haven't felt in a very long time, begins to creep into your heart. It is not fear exactly. It is confusion. It is the jarring realization that the fundamental truths of air combat, the truths that have kept you alive and made you an ace, may no longer apply. You bank your Zero hard, scanning the sky. Another of the new American fighters flashes past you in a dive, incredibly fast. You hear a loud thump and your plane shudders. A single, heavy-caliber bullet has passed through your left wing, leaving a clean, round hole. It didn't hit anything vital, but you know that if that had been a burst, your plane, with its unprotected fuel tanks and light frame, would have met the same fate as Sato's. You look at the American plane, now climbing away again. Impervious, untouchable. You realize with a sudden, dreadful clarity that these are not the same opponents you have been fighting. This is a new animal. This is a predator built not for grace, but for pure, overwhelming power. The fight lasted only a few minutes. For the American pilots, it was a stunning, resounding success. They returned to the Yorktown, their planes refueled and rearmed, buzzing with adrenaline and a newfound, unshakable confidence. They had met the ghost of the Pacific, the legendary Zero, and they had crushed it. Hamilton McWhorter had just scored his first victory on his first combat mission. He would go on to become one of the Navy's first Hellcat aces. For the surviving Japanese pilots who managed to escape the slaughter over Marcus Island, their return was somber. Their reports were filled with disbelief. They described a new American fighter that was as fast as a lightning strike, as tough as a flying fortress, and armed with guns that could tear a Zero to pieces in a single burst. The myth of their own supremacy, a belief that had been the bedrock of their naval air arm, had been shattered in a single morning. The reign of the Zero was not just challenged, it was over. And a long, brutal war in the sky had just entered a new and deadly chapter. dominated by the roar of the Hellcat. The news of the Hellcat's debut over Marcus Island spread through the U.S. Pacific Fleet like a cleansing fire. It traveled in the dry official language of after-action reports and in the excited informal chatter of pilots in the ready rooms. For the first time, there was a sense of parity, a feeling that the technological scales had not just been balanced, but had tipped decisively in their favor. The ghost of the Zero had been exorcised. But the true story of the Hellcat's dominance wasn't written in a single battle. It was written thousands of miles away, back on Long Island, New York, in a place that roared with a different kind of power. This was the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation's plant in Bethpage, a place that came to be known simply as the Iron Works. If you could drift back in time and stand on the floor of that factory in late 1943, the scale of the operation would be almost incomprehensible. The air would be a constant symphony of industry, the sharp, percussive chatter of 10,000 riveting guns, the low groan of heavy machinery, the high-pitched whine of metal being cut and shaped. It was a vast, sprawling city under one roof, illuminated by harsh industrial lights that cast long shadows, a place that never slept. And working on the assembly lines were thousands upon thousands of people. Many were women, the iconic Rosie the Riveters, who had come from all corners of the country to do their part. They moved with a focused, rhythmic grace, their hands, once perhaps used to typing or baking, now skillfully operating complex machinery, stitching together the pieces of a warplane. From this immense, roaring factory, a river of dark blue steel flowed into the sky. At its peak, the Grumman Iron Works was producing more than 600 planes a month. Think of that. One factory pushing out a Hellcat nearly every single hour, 24 hours a day. This was the industrial heart of America, awakened and focused on a single purpose. It was a power that Japan, for all its martial skill and initial success, simply could not match. Japanese aircraft production was more of a craftsman's art. Their factories were smaller, their resources scarcer. They could produce a few hundred Zeros a month across their entire empire. Grumman alone was outproducing them several times over. For every Hellcat that was shot down or lost in an accident, 10 more were already on a ship, crossing the Pacific to take its place. This industrial might created the first half of the equation. The second, and arguably more important half, was being forged under the hot sun of places like Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida. Here, another kind of assembly line was at work, the pilot training program. Japan had begun the war with an elite corps of naval aviators. They were the best in the world, hardened by years of intense, almost cruelly selective training and combat experience over China. But they were a finite resource. When one of these masters was lost, he was irreplaceable. Japan's training pipeline was slow and small, unable to quickly produce new pilots to fill the ranks. America's approach was, once again, one of mass production. Young men from farms in Iowa, from cities like Chicago and Boston, from small towns all across the nation, were funneled into a massive, standardized training program. They were taught the basics of flight, navigation, and gunnery in a systematic, efficient process. They were not, perhaps, the natural-born artists of the sky that their Japanese counterparts were. But they didn't need to be, because the plane they were being given was designed for them. The Hellcat was more than just a Zero killer. It was an ace maker. It was an inherently stable, forgiving aircraft. It could absorb mistakes that would have sent a more temperamental plane into an unrecoverable spin. Its wide landing gear made the terrifying ordeal of landing on a moving carrier deck far less perilous than in other planes. The cockpit was designed for function and a degree of comfort, with logically placed instruments and excellent visibility. In short, it was a plane that looked after its pilot. It allowed a young man with only a few hundred hours of flight time to enter a complex and deadly environment and perform effectively, and most importantly, to survive long enough to learn, to gain experience, and to become a veteran himself. Imagine being one of those young pilots. You are barely 20 years old. A year ago, you were driving a tractor or studying for college exams. Now you are at the controls of a 2,000 horsepower war machine. As you practice your maneuvers over the Gulf of Mexico, you can feel the plane's honesty. When you push it, it responds with predictable power. If you make a clumsy move, it doesn't try to kill you. It shudders a bit, letting you know your error, giving you time to correct. You feel the armor plate behind your seat, a solid, reassuring presence. You know about the self-sealing fuel tanks, the sheer toughness of the airframe. The plane gives you confidence. It tells you, in its mechanical language of vibration and response, that it will do its best to bring you home. This combination, a flood of new, powerful, and durable aircraft, flown by a constantly replenished pool of well-trained pilots, fundamentally changed the character of the air war in the Pacific. By 1944, the dynamic had completely inverted. It was now the Japanese who were sending young, hastily trained pilots into the sky, often with as little as 100 hours of flight time. They were flying the same Zeros from the start of the war, now worn down and outmatched. The encounters were no longer tense duels between near equals. They were systematic, brutal, and tragically one-sided. The great carrier battles of 1944 were not really battles in the sky. They were harvests. Squadrons of Hellcats would launch from the American carriers, climbing to high altitude, forming a protective screen known as the Combat Air Patrol, or CAP. When the radar operators on the ships below detected incoming Japanese formations, they would vector the Hellcats to intercept. A Hellcat pilot on one of these missions would see the enemy approaching not as a collection of individual threats, but as a target set. The Japanese planes, often a mix of bombers and their Zero escorts, would be flying in a rigid formation. The Hellcats would descend upon them like wolves on a flock of sheep. The conversations on the American radio channels were now calm, professional, almost businesslike. "Tally-ho, I've got the ones on the left. Roger that, I'm taking the leader." The boom and zoom tactic was executed with cold precision. A Hellcat would dive, its engine screaming, its 6 guns erupting in a short, controlled burst. A Japanese plane would disintegrate. The Hellcat would then use its momentum to climb back up, reposition, and select another target. There was no need to stay and dogfight. There was no need to take unnecessary risks. It was a clinical, overwhelming application of superior technology and tactics. The Japanese pilots, for all their courage and devotion to their emperor, were powerless. They were flying coffins, sent out on missions from which there was very little chance of return. Their reign was over, and the sky that had once been their exclusive hunting ground now belonged to the deep blue fighters of the United States Navy. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had reached its terrible crescendo. The American war machine, which had been slowly gathering momentum, was now a tidal wave of steel, sweeping across the Central Pacific, island by island, drawing ever closer to Japan itself. The next major objective was the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Capturing these islands would put American B-29 superfortresses within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. For the Japanese High Command, this was the line that could not be crossed. They knew that if the Marianas fell, the war would be all but lost. And so, they gathered everything they had left for one final, decisive battle. A naval showdown they called Operation A-Go. It was a desperate gamble, designed to lure the American fleet into a trap and destroy it with the full might of their carrier air power. The Japanese commanders still believed in the superiority of their pilots and their machines, a belief born from the glorious victories of 1941 and 1942. They were sailing into battle with the ghosts of the past, unaware they were about to face the brutal reality of the present. On the 19th of June 1944, aboard the carriers of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The fleet's commander, Admiral Raymond Spruance, was a calm, calculating man. He had defeated the Japanese at Midway by letting them make the first move, and he intended to do the same again. His fleet was positioned to protect the invasion forces at Saipan, and he had something the Japanese could not have conceived of 2 years earlier: an almost impenetrable shield of technology and air power. Deep within the steel hulls of the American carriers, in darkened rooms known as the Combat Information Center, or CIC, men sat hunched over the glowing green screens of new, powerful radar sets. In the early morning hours, the screens began to flicker. At first, it was a single, faint blip on the edge of the scope, then another, and another. Soon, the screens were filled with them. The radar operators began calling out contacts, their voices tense but controlled. The incoming raids were not in groups of 10 or 20. They were coming in waves of 50, 60, 70 planes at a time. In total, more than 370 Japanese aircraft were flying towards the American fleet. It was the largest carrier air attack of the war. The call went out across the fleet. "Launch the fighters!" On the flight decks, the roar of double Wasp engines became a continuous, deafening thunder. In cockpits, pilots went through their final checks, their faces illuminated by the instrument panels. These were not the greenhorns of Marcus Island. Many were now seasoned veterans, aces with multiple victories to their name. They flew their Hellcats with a quiet, lethal confidence. They knew their machines, and they knew their enemy. Imagine yourself in one of those cockpits, being shot from the catapult into the humid morning air. You join a vast swarm of dark blue fighters, hundreds of them, climbing to meet the enemy. The radio, once a place for nervous chatter, is now a channel of clipped, professional communication, as the fighter directors in the CIC below orchestrate the battle. They are the chess masters, seeing the whole board on their radar screens, moving their pieces, the squadrons of Hellcats, to intercept the incoming threat. Vector 300, Angels 20, bandits. Many, many bandits. You fly on the directed heading, climbing through the scattered clouds, and then you see them. The sight is almost unbelievable. The sky ahead is filled with Japanese planes, stretching for miles, a vast armada of bombers, torpedo planes, and their escorting Zeros. But there is no panic. There is only the cold calculus of the fight. Your squadron commander's voice is a point of calm in the chaos. "Okay, fellas, pick your targets. Let's go to work." You push the nose of your Hellcat over and begin your dive. The wind screams past your canopy. The world narrows to the glowing pipper of your gun sight. You select a group of Judy dive bombers, sleek but vulnerable. You are moving with such speed that the Zero's flying escort above them cannot possibly catch you. You close the distance in seconds. Your thumb finds the trigger. You fire a short, 2-second burst. The .50 caliber rounds, like a focused beam of destruction, tear into the wing root of the lead bomber. A bright orange fire blossoms, and the plane twists out of formation, trailing a thick plume of black smoke as it begins its final, long fall to the sea. You don't watch it go down. You use your speed to pull up in a great, soaring chandelle, converting your kinetic energy back into altitude. You scan the sky, assess the situation, and select your next target. A Zero has detached from the escort and is trying to engage one of your squadron mates. You roll over and dive again. The Zero pilot sees you coming and tries to pull into a tight defensive turn, the classic maneuver that once made his plane invincible. But you don't follow him. You simply slice through the top of his turn, give him another short, precise burst, and watch his plane shudder and fall away. The entire engagement takes less than 10 seconds. It is not a dogfight. It is an execution. All across the sky, for hours, this scene is repeated hundreds of times. The Japanese formations are savaged long before they ever get a glimpse of the American carriers they are supposed to attack. The pilots are brave, but their bravery is not enough. Their skills are sharp, but their planes are fragile and outmatched. They are met by a wall of American fighters that are faster, tougher, better armed, and flown by well-trained pilots who are directed with a terrifying, radar-guided precision. The radio chatter on the American frequency soon took on an almost surreal tone of excitement and disbelief. One pilot, returning to rearm, was heard to exclaim to his wingmen, "Why hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot back home." The name stuck. The air battle of June 19, 1944 would forever be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the end of the day, the numbers told the story with chilling finality. The Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft and the irreplaceable veteran pilots who flew them. The United States Navy had lost less than 30 Hellcats, many of them to accidents or running out of fuel, not to enemy fire. It was the single most lopsided air battle in history, a complete and catastrophic annihilation of Japanese naval air power. They would never again launch a major carrier strike. Their reign over the Pacific, which had begun with a stunning victory at Pearl Harbor, had ended in a slaughterhouse sky over the Philippine Sea. The Hellcat would go on to serve until the very end of the war, its pilots racking up more aerial victories than any other Allied aircraft in the Pacific. It protected the fleet, supported the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and cleared the skies for the final assault on Japan. It was never the most elegant plane, nor the most advanced, but it was the right plane at the right time, a perfect embodiment of the nation that built it. Strong, dependable, overwhelming. It was the hammer that broke the samurai's sword. And now our story comes to a close. The roar of the engines fades. The skies over the vast Pacific are quiet once more, ruled only by the wind and the cry of the gulls. The great carriers have returned to their home ports, and the young men who flew the Hellcats have gone back to their lives, carrying with them memories of a time when they touched the clouds and changed the course of history. The Hellcat, the ace maker, the tool of victory, now sits silent in museums, a quiet testament to a turbulent past. Let the peace of this silence settle over you, a gentle quiet after a long and epic tale. The battle is over, The sky is clear. It is time to rest.